Hello, drawing students. This is a lecture on mark making. Yay! So, we will be utilizing the technique of a mark making and the techniques within, and applying them to what we know of value. So, we are still assessing proportions, citing, getting correct proportions, and then we are addressing value by using mark making within this technique here. So, what is mark making? It refers to the application of marks that vary in their weight, value, texture, length, and direction. Their density determines the resulting value. So, the application of marks that vary in their weight, value, texture, length, and direction. This is sounding a lot like line quality, right? Well, with mark making, we're using shorter marks oftentimes. Well, yeah, not all the time. We're using marks that are usually repetitious in some way, and they are used to they're either expressively used, so not necessarily in a representative way, or they can be representatively used to describe value. Hence, their density determines the resulting value. So for the darker areas, for our core shadow and cast shadow areas, we'll use really dense areas of these mark making techniques. So I'm going to go over quite a few different techniques of mark making that we will go over and apply in our drawings. The first one is hatching, and that is the use of lines or strokes of varying lengths that are grouped together to form value. Now we'll get into more specific forms of hatching, but this is the most simplistic way of looking at it. We have groups of repetitious strokes together that are being used in different directions to describe the value shape. Again, they're not overlapping each other, they're just next to each other, and they're being used in different directions. But again, repetitious and and then being turned in different directions. Parallel hatching is the use of lines or strokes which are uniformly aligned, parallel to each other without regard for planar structure. So, parallel hatching is the same idea as hatching, but just being used in one direction, and we're not thinking necessarily about the way that the form is turning. The line instead is doing that, but with the parallel hatching, we just use one direction of line next to each other. Again, hatching here to show you the difference, where we do have parallel lines next to each other, but we have multiple directions of the hatching quality. They're turned in multiple different directions, and not concerned here with the planar structure. Notice here, the closer the lines are, the darker it looks. So again, their density determines the value. Contour hatching, which is something I really want you guys to be thinking about and using in your drawings. This is one that I really want you to utilize, and I'll get into why. Contour hatching is the use of lines or strokes which follow the curvature or planar directions of the object. The strokes may curve on a curved plane or may be straight as they follow a flat plane. Now, the reason why I want you guys to be thinking about this is because it's going to reinforce in your brain you're still very new to learning how to draw, this will reinforce for you the planar and curvature makeup of the forms that you are drawing. So we think about, with each direction of the line, we think about how the plane is shifting. So this thumb is wrapping around like this. We could have done just parallel hatching, right? As you saw before with parallel hatching, we're not concerned about the curvature plane. It's just more of a graphic way of using the line. Here we're giving even more form and dimensionality to the form because we're considering the direction the lines are going to reinforce that shape. Your constant struggle as a two-dimensional artist is to try and give the illusion of a three-dimensional thing. So anything you can use to help you in that fight is very useful and is very good for you to learn. So that is what this contour hatching is talking about. It's going along the contours, along the curvature of the plane. Again, so we have this thumb that comes up. This is the thenar muscle in the thumb. And so we have the curvilinear, the contour hatching going in that direction to reinforce the idea that these planes are wrapping around in that direction, giving even more form and dimensionality. This looks like a Dürer, Albrecht Dürer etching, but it says it's anonymous, but maybe it actually is anonymous. But so here's another example of that contour hatching. Again, thinking about the curvature of those planes and reinforcing that. So contour hatching. Here is Kathy Kollwitz, and interspersed throughout this lecture, I have a couple artists that use mark making very well. Kathy Kollwitz is a very renowned for her mark making qualities. She's using contour hatching, as well as just very expressive mark making. So sometimes her mark making is helping to describe the form. So she's using that contour hatching here, how it's describing the form of the forehead. She's using hatching as well, but she's using it more expressively and more loosely. You can see it here. This is more expressive, as in it's not necessarily, it's describing this form on the side of her face here, but it's moving towards abstraction in a way. And here we have just this zigzag line that is very effectively describing the movement that this arm is taking. So again, this is in the expressive quality of mark making, but it is quite economically done. Economically meaning effective with very little work done, right? So I wanted to show you some Kathy Kollwitz. Okay, and then we're on to cross hatching. So that's taking the idea of hatching and layering it on top of each other. So the use of parallel hatching lines which change angles or direction as they are overlaid, rapidly building value range. The directional change can be minimal or as much as 90 degrees. So, for instance, we have hatching happening in this direction and then a 90-degree change right here in this direction. But we have every change in between. And this is kind of using that idea of rendering that we were talking about, where we were layering in multiple directions with our very soft, light strokes of our pencil on the side of our pencil. Here, we're tipping the pencil upward. We're using the tip of the pencil or the medium, whatever medium you're using. And we're separating those marks. We're isolating those marks so that we have line that is repeated next to each other, and then we're still layering it in multiple directions here. So we have multiple strokes going in this direction, and then we change direction and go this way, and then we change direction again and go this way, and that rapidly builds value. Notice how we kind of selectively use multiple layers of the cross hatching for the very dark areas. So we'll layer those cross hatching techniques and layer them very densely in core shadow areas. See how we have this highlight going across the top of the finger here, and then we have a core shadow. We have a core shadow that starts very closely there with multiple dark lines of cross hatching on top. So again, use of parallel hatching lines which change angles or direction as they are overlaid, rapidly building value range. So these are overlaid uses of the hatching, the parallel hatching. Okay. Some more artists. Rembrandt. Look at all this mark making up here. We have a lot of combination of uses of mark making here where we don't really fit necessarily in one of the categories that we just talked about. With Rembrandt, he's using, and all these artists are using all of them interchangeably and in their own way, right? Uniquely. So here we have parallel hatching up here where you see these lines really long next to each other. But then we have cross hatching over here. We have kind of more squiggle marks around here, and we'll talk about that in a second. More parallel hatching down here, but still very expressive and descriptive at the same time. Notice again the density. Density is talking about a lot of layers, or the closeness that the marks are to each other. The closer the marks are to each other, the denser those marks are, and the darker those areas are. That's what that density is talking about. Sorry, don't mean to freak you out. This is a pretty famous Rembrandt self-portrait, kind of the freak out eyes here, but very up close image of that mark making in the way that he's using it to describe the face. It's very loose but very descriptive. Every line has a purpose and it's describing something very specifically. So look at here, we have cross hatching here, one direction here, another direction here. We have contour hatching happening on the upper lip here. Some more contour hatching on the nose. Lots of cross hatching in the hat and the hair. But we get looser with so looser as in the marks are farther apart in areas that are lighter. In areas where we just want a little bit of value, the marks are farther apart. And the marks are much closer together the closer that they are. Or, what did I say? The marks are much darker. The marks are much closer together in the darker areas, right? Really nice mark making here. Look at this parallel hatching here. And the marks are much wider apart, and that's making this a much lighter area. And this is a much darker area because of how dense these marks are. We have a lot of overlaying marks and a lot of really dark marks. Very dense, very little paper being seen through this area. That's what's making it darker. But he gets wider apart with his marks, the lighter he wants the area to be. So again, hatching, cross hatching, parallel hatching. Okay, and then we have stippling or pointillism. Pointillism is the correct term. I put the word stippling in there. I guess they're interchangeable, but often reserved for pen and ink or markers. Stippling refers to the application of dots or value laid down one at a time. The density of dots determines the resulting value. So again, denser areas of dots makes this area much darker right here, right? This can be really detailed, but again, it's exactly as I described it here above. You're just using the tip of a marker usually, or a pen. You can't really do this very well with a pencil. Pencil doesn't leave that kind of a mark. So you're just very quickly making these dotted points, and where you're keeping them more dense is where you're having darker value shapes. And as they get farther apart, they get lighter. I do have some markers here. I know you probably don't have these Staedtler pigment liner markers. So you can buy specific markers for drawing. Staedtler makes really nice ones. These go from 0.1 millimeter to 0.7 millimeter. And then also a good brand is Micron. Micron pens. And they sell these at any art store. And what these are really fine tipped markers. I'll just pull out the 0.3 millimeter one. Very fine point markers that can give you this kind of a quality, but they're also actually really fun to use for any of the mark making techniques. Okay. So probably I would venture to say the most famous artist that has used pointillism, or really what made pointillism famous, was George Seurat. So he's mostly he did a lot of pointillism paintings. So notice here the density of the marks here, the density of the points and the dots. This is a supremely time-consuming technique. It is not fast. It is very slow. This might not be pointillism. It looked like it. I don't think it is. Scribbling. I'm not a big fan of this one, but I shouldn't say that. I just don't particularly have fun using it, but it is a very legitimate way of using mark making. Use of free-form but controlled scribble lines to create value. The density of the scribble lines determines the resulting value. So the key word here being controlled. So we're not just kind of wherever we want to put scribbles. It's that we are specifically using scribble marks and controlling them and making them denser in areas so we want them to be a darker area. But again, the farther apart the scribble lines are, the lighter the area is, right? Giacometti is a really good artist for this technique. Very famous for his elongated figure sculptures. But he uses a lot of these scribble techniques to describe the portrait. But again, very controlled. He knows exactly where he wants his line to go. It's almost as if he is feeling this form, and through that feeling he is able to describe it on a two-dimensional surface. This is a really good still life drawing of his. Using that scribble line technique is almost very sketchy, but yeah. Oop. Okay. So that is the end of the mark making lecture. Remember, we had scribbling, stippling or pointillism, that's using the tip of the marker, the tip of the pen, in dots. And the denser they are, the darker that value is. Very time-consuming technique. We have cross-hatching, which is the layering of parallel hatching lines in multiple directions. So they're overlaid and they're rapidly building value because they're being overlaid. So it's these marks that we're building and we're overlaying them on top of each other in multiple directions. But we're specifically layering them a lot in the core shadow areas. Kathy Kolowitz. And then contour hatching is what I want you to be thinking about as well. And that's using hatching specifically in the direction that the form is taking. Remember how we were thinking about that when we were doing rendering? We weren't just trying to render in a way that would make this look flatter, right? In the elongated way of rendering, we're thinking about how can we make this look even more dimensional as much as we possibly can with the tools that we have. And so we're thinking about the contours, the change of the form, the wrapping of the form in space, and mimicking that with our marks. So that's what this contour hatching is doing. Parallel hatching, the use of strokes uniformly aligned and not thinking about planar structure. So we're just simply using these straight lines, and again, that's more of a graphic look that we get. And then just strictly hatching, not overlaid. So that's the beginning form of using mark making, and then we build up to cross hatching from there. All right, we'll end on Rembrandt.